In the quiet suburb of Glikonera, Athens, the sun rose over an ordinary morning in the Crouch household. The neighborhood, lined with white-painted villas and well-kept gardens, was known for its calm, its peace only broken by the occasional chirp of birds or the distant hum of city traffic. At first glance, nothing about the morning seemed out of place. But within the walls of one of these homes, a deadly crime had been committed. Caroline Crouch, a 20-year-old woman of British and Filipino descent, was found lifeless in her bedroom. Her husband, Babis Anagnostopoulos, a 33-year-old helicopter pilot, called the authorities, reporting a home invasion gone horribly wrong. Three armed men, he claimed, had broken into their house, tied him up, and killed Caroline in cold blood before fleeing the scene. Their infant daughter, Lydia, was unharmed, still asleep in her crib beside her mother's body. The investigators were soon on the scene. It seemed straightforward enough, a home invasion. But as the hours passed, the strange inconsistencies started to emerge. It wasn't the first time police had seen a case like this, but there was something about the Crouch case that didn't sit right. The house showed no signs of forced entry. The doors were unlocked, yet there was no trace of the supposed intruders, no footprints, no broken windows, nothing out of the ordinary. The scene didn't match Bobby's story, and that was where the questions began. How could three intruders enter and leave without leaving a mark? Where was the evidence of a struggle? And then there was Babis himself. Babis was calm, almost too calm for a man who had just witnessed his wife's murder. He was in shock, sure, but something about his demeanor set off alarms in the minds of the detectives who were arriving at the scene. The body of Caroline Crouch lay motionless, but there was something about Babis that felt off. In his recollection, the events unfolded in too neat of a sequence. The police noticed that he gave no further details about the alleged assailants. His story lacked any specifics. When asked to recount more of the timeline, he was vague, unable to offer any clarity. But the inconsistencies were only just beginning. At first, it appeared as though the case would be solved quickly. Babis seemed the victim of an extraordinary circumstance, and Caroline, a young woman with no apparent enemies, was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet there was no conclusive forensic evidence to corroborate Babis' story. No blood smears near the doors, no signs of struggle, no fingerprints on the windows or doorknobs. The detectives, led by their seasoned supervisor, couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was wrong. It didn't make sense. There was a twist lurking under the surface, and they needed to find it. Their instincts told them Babis might not be the victim he claimed to be. But how could this be? Where was the evidence to prove it? Detectives turned their attention to the most important evidence they could gather. Data. Caroline's smartwatch, which she always wore, was one of the first items they examined. It might just hold the key to unlocking the truth. What would the data show? Did it corroborate Babis' timeline? The smartwatch data revealed a shocking inconsistency. Caroline was still alive several hours after Babis had reported the crime. This was the first crack in his story. The timeline he had so confidently delivered was now in question. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that something larger was at play here. A web of lies, carefully constructed. The truth was just out of reach, but they were getting closer. The case began to evolve, from what seemed like a tragic accident to a carefully executed crime. The authorities shifted their focus from the intruders that Babis had described to Babis himself. He had, after all, been the last person to see Caroline alive. In a case like this, where every detail mattered, the investigators couldn't afford to make assumptions. They combed through the evidence methodically. Every piece of forensic data was analyzed, no matter how small. Digital footprints, phone records, smartwatch data. It all had to be carefully pieced together like a puzzle. The detectives knew that only the smallest oversight could allow a murderer to slip through their fingers. But the pieces were starting to fit too well. The investigators were getting closer. Babis' lies were unraveling with every new forensic discovery. But the question remained, what was his true motive? It wasn't long before the investigators learned of the cracks in Babis and Caroline's marriage. Caroline had confided in friends about her fears of Babis. She had started to suspect him of being involved in shady activities, things that could ruin him. That was the first hint of what might be the real motive behind Caroline's death. But there were still so many unknowns. Babis claimed to have been tied up during the incident. The physical evidence did not support this. There was no sign of restraint on his wrists, no abrasions, no marks from ropes or any binding material. How could that be? If he was tied up, why were there no signs? Why was he not bruised or injured in any way? His clothing, untouched, his behavior. Each of these details was starting to reveal a deeper, darker story. The investigators continued their work, fully aware that each new piece of information brought them closer to the truth. With each day that passed, the pieces began to form a picture, one that would eventually reveal the shocking truth. In the quiet aftermath of Caroline Crouch's tragic death, investigators began to piece together what they could from the scene. What appeared at first to be a simple case of a botched robbery was soon becoming something much more complicated. The house had been preserved as the crime scene, and the investigation began in earnest. The authorities immediately noticed that the details surrounding Caroline's death didn't quite align with the story told by her husband, Babis Anagnostopoulos. Babis had been the one to find his wife's body. His initial statement suggested a violent home invasion. 3 armed intruders had broken in, bound him, and murdered Caroline in cold blood before fleeing the scene. It seemed like a straightforward account, except for one glaring issue. The house showed no signs of a forced entry. The front door was unlocked, but it had not been tampered with. There were no signs of windows or doors being broken, no forced entry marks. Even the glass from the broken window that Babis claimed the intruders had exited from was intact. The lack of physical evidence to corroborate Babis's story was troubling, but it was only the beginning of the inconsistencies. Investigators turned their attention to the digital evidence. Forensic specialists began scouring Caroline's personal devices, focusing on her phone and smartwatch. Items Babis hadn't initially mentioned. Caroline had always been diligent about wearing her smartwatch, a piece of technology that tracked her movements, heart rate, and other data points. It wasn't long before the data revealed something startling. The smartwatch indicated that Caroline had been active long after Babis had claimed she was dead. Babis had stated that Caroline died within minutes of the supposed home invasion, but the smartwatch showed that her heart rate remained stable for several hours after he claimed she had been murdered. This created a massive discrepancy, undermining the veracity of his account. If Caroline had been alive, then where had she been during those hours? If the intruders had truly been in the house, why was her smartwatch still recording vital signs at the time Babis had reported her death? The evidence was damning, and the detectives knew they had to take a closer look at Babis. The following morning, Babis was brought in for a second round of questioning. At this point, the police had already begun to notice further inconsistencies in his behavior. His calm, almost detached demeanor, especially in the face of such a horrific crime, stood out. Most people, even under extreme stress, would show more emotional response. But Babis seemed strangely composed. The detectives could not help but wonder, could his calmness be the result of a man hiding something? The questioning began innocuously. Babis stuck to his story about the intruders, but as the detectives pressed him on specific details, the cracks began to show. The more he spoke, the more he contradicted himself. For example, when asked about the layout of the house, Babis seemed unsure of the order in which events had occurred. He couldn't explain why Caroline's phone was left behind in the house, or why her vehicle had been parked outside if she had been fleeing a robbery. Then there was the issue of the infant, Lydia, who had been found unharmed beside her mother's body. How had the intruders been so careful to avoid harming the baby, but not Caroline? It seemed unlikely for a gang of robbers to have such a precise approach in a crime of violence. Babis became more evasive under questioning, offering only vague answers. The detectives were no longer satisfied with his narrative. There was too much that didn't add up. They needed more information, something concrete to break the case wide open. As investigators continued to delve into the details of Babis' background, they discovered troubling evidence that pointed to his involvement in criminal activities. Babis had a history that wasn't entirely spotless. There were rumors of connections to drug trafficking, although these had not been substantiated at the time. Caroline had reportedly discovered these activities, which may have been one of the driving factors behind her growing unease and fear. Friends and family members of Caroline started to speak more openly about the tension in the Crouch household. Caroline's loved ones confirmed that she had been acting increasingly anxious in the weeks leading up to her death. She had confided in her friends about her growing suspicions about Babis. She had also expressed fear that he would retaliate if she ever tried to leave him. Caroline's fear for her life had been mounting, and her journal entries, discovered later, indicated that she had been planning to leave him. Could this be the motive? Was Babis so desperate to keep his secrets hidden that he resorted to murder? The possibility seemed more and more likely. While Babis continued to offer his statements, the forensic team began their own meticulous work. They processed the scene for any overlooked details, and soon they uncovered something that would prove critical: the lack of any physical evidence tying Babis to the crime scene. Babis had claimed to have been bound by the intruders, but forensic specialists found no signs of rope marks or abrasions on his skin. There were no fibers from the ropes, no other traces of struggle, nothing to suggest that he had been tied up as he had described. The only conclusion that could be drawn from the evidence was that Babis had been free during the time of the murder. Moreover, the absence of a forced entry into the house meant that the crime had been planned, or, at the very least, that the intruders had known the layout of the home. Babis himself had access to the house, and given his personal connection to Caroline, he was now under intense scrutiny. The inconsistencies were overwhelming. Babis had lied to the police about being bound. He had provided false information about the timeline of events. He had fabricated a story about the intruders. With every step, the police were piecing together the truth. Babis was no longer just a victim. He was a suspect. As investigators continued to examine the evidence surrounding Caroline Crouch's tragic death, it became increasingly clear that Babis Anagnostopoulos' initial account was filled with inconsistencies. What had begun as a simple case of a violent robbery was now taking on a much more sinister form. The key to unraveling the truth lay not in Baby's story, but in the evidence: the physical traces left behind at the crime scene, and the digital footprint that would eventually lead to his downfall. The first clue came from Caroline's smartwatch. The device, which had tracked her movements and heart rate, had not only contradicted Babis' timeline, but painted a far darker picture of the night she died. According to Babis, Caroline had been killed almost immediately after the supposed home invasion. However, the data showed that Caroline's heart rate remained steady for hours after he claimed she was dead. That was the first major discrepancy. If Caroline had been alive for that long after Babis had made the initial call to the police, then her death had occurred under very different circumstances than Babis had reported. This inconsistency set the stage for a deeper investigation into the crime scene. Forensic experts began to analyze the house, looking for any physical evidence that could either support or disprove Babis' story. The scene was meticulously preserved, every corner examined, every possible clue examined under a magnifying glass. The house had been locked from the inside, yet there were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no signs of a struggle at the door. The supposed intruders had not left behind any trace of themselves. The lack of forced entry was significant. It suggested that whoever had committed the crime was familiar with the house, or at the very least was allowed access. It was as if the house had been carefully set up to look like a home invasion, but the evidence told a different story. Babis' account of being bound and helpless during the attack could not be corroborated. Forensic investigators found no signs of restraint, no rope burns or abrasions on his wrists. In fact, Babis had shown no signs of having been tied up at all. His clothing was untouched, his movements unrestricted. The only reasonable conclusion the investigators could draw was that Babis had been free during the entire event. At this point, the investigation took a critical turn. The lack of physical evidence supporting Babis' version of events led the police to delve deeper into his past. Investigators examined Babis' background with more scrutiny, as they began to suspect that there might be a darker motive behind Caroline's death than simple robbery. Babis had a history that wasn't widely known to those around him. Though outwardly successful, his personal and professional life had hidden shadows. There were rumors of ties to criminal activities, particularly drug trafficking. Caroline had reportedly discovered this just before her death, and her friends and family testified that she had expressed concerns about leaving him due to these revelations. This gave rise to the possibility that Babis had killed Caroline to prevent her from exposing his dangerous secrets. As detectives continued to investigate, They found that Caroline had been planning to leave Babis. In the months leading up to her death, she had become increasingly afraid of him. There were records of her talking to friends about her suspicions, about the things she had uncovered. She had written in her journals describing her growing fear and her plans to leave him. But those plans would never be realized. Caroline's desire to escape her marriage seemed to be the catalyst for her murder. The forensic experts continued their work, focusing on the details that might have been overlooked at first. They examined the security footage from the area surrounding the house. Babis had told investigators that the intruders had fled the scene, but the footage from the cameras surrounding the house told a different story. There was no rush of intruders, no panicked escape. The video showed nothing of the sort. What was captured, however, was Babis leaving the house hours after the murder had been reported, alone. No sign of any intruders. The timeline was now clear. Babis had been the only person involved in his wife's death. With the mounting evidence against him, Babis' story began to fall apart. It wasn't just the inconsistencies in his statements or the absence of physical evidence. It was the video footage, the forensic analysis, and the troubling details about his past that painted a clear picture of what had actually happened. Babis had not been the victim of a robbery. He had orchestrated his wife's death to protect his secrets and maintain control over his life. As investigators closed in on Babis, the pieces of the puzzle came together. The murder of Carolyn Crouch was no longer a mystery. It was a crime driven by desperation, fear, and a desire to protect dark secrets. The truth was now undeniable. The investigation into Caroline Crouch's death had now reached a pivotal point. With each passing day, the evidence was mounting against Babis Anagnostopoulos. His lies were unraveling under the pressure of forensic analysis, and the detectives were closing in on him. But it wasn't just physical evidence or inconsistencies in his testimony that were beginning to expose the truth. It was the deeper psychological profile of the suspect that was now coming into focus. Forensic teams continued to focus on the crucial details, the kind that could make or break a case. The absence of any signs of struggle was particularly telling. Babis had claimed to have been tied up, but there was no evidence to support that. No rope burns, no abrasions, no signs of him having been restrained. The only explanation was simple. Babis had not been restrained because there had been no intruders. He had been free during the entire event, and he had killed his wife without anyone else being involved. But the lack of physical evidence wasn't the only problem with Babis' story. As the investigation progressed, detectives dug deeper into his personal life. His background was far from spotless. Babis had always kept up appearances, a successful helicopter pilot with a seemingly perfect family. But behind the scenes, he had a history of secrecy and control. It became clear that he had been hiding a life full of lies and potential criminal involvement. Investigators learned that Caroline had begun to uncover his dark secrets in the months leading up to her death. There were rumors about Babis' ties to drug trafficking, a connection Caroline had reportedly discovered. Her growing fears about his dangerous activities were confirmed by friends and family who recalled conversations with Caroline about leaving Babis. She had been afraid, but also determined to escape the relationship before it was too late. The tension in their marriage had been building for months. Caroline had felt trapped, both emotionally and physically. The forensic evidence now suggested that her death wasn't just a random act of violence, but the tragic result of Babis' desperation to keep his secrets hidden. As Caroline had grown more fearful, Babis had grown more controlling. His need to protect himself and his dangerous lifestyle led him to make a fatal decision. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators focused on the surveillance footage from the surrounding area. The footage from the night of the murder contradicted Babis' story. He had claimed that intruders had fled the scene, but the cameras showed no sign of anyone leaving the house. There was no rush of escape, no frantic movement outside the house. Instead, the footage showed Babis leaving the house hours after the alleged crime had taken place, alone. This new evidence confirmed the investigators' suspicions. Babis had staged the crime scene and fabricated a story about intruders to cover up his actions. Babis had been at the center of the crime from the beginning. He had orchestrated everything. The robbery story was a fabrication, a desperate attempt to hide the truth. But the evidence, physical, digital, and psychological, had exposed him for what he truly was, a man willing to kill to keep his secret safe. The final pieces of the puzzle came together as investigators pieced together Babis' psychological profile. He had been manipulative and controlling throughout his relationship with Caroline, and the pressure of her impending departure had driven him to violence. His need for control had ultimately led to his downfall. Caroline had been a threat to everything he had built, and in a moment of desperation, he chose to eliminate that threat. At this stage of the investigation, there was no longer any doubt about Babis's involvement in the murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The investigators were now preparing to confront him with the truth. By the time the investigators had gathered enough evidence, there was no longer any question as to what had transpired in the Crouch household on that fateful night. The evidence was irrefutable. Babis Anagnostopoulos had murdered his wife, Caroline Crouch. What remained now was for the police to confront him with the truth. It was time to bring him in for questioning again. Babis was once again seated in a sterile, dimly lit interrogation room. His face, which had once shown signs of grief and shock, was now hardened, almost as if he were preparing for a battle of wits. His earlier bravado had been replaced by a more calculated demeanor. The once seemingly distressed man now appeared resigned, but there was still a subtle arrogance in his eyes, a belief that somehow he could outsmart those who were investigating him. The detectives, having pieced together the full extent of his lies, began their methodical approach. They knew the facts. They knew the timeline. They knew about the smartwatch data that contradicted his statements, the lack of evidence for his claim of being tied up, and the disturbing background that suggested a motive far darker than just a crime of passion. But they needed Babis to admit it, to confess. The interrogator began with a simple, cold question. "Why did you do it, Babis?" The silence in the room was palpable. Babis stared at the floor, the weight of the question settling over him like a fog. For a moment, he didn't respond. The detectives let the silence linger, letting him feel the pressure building. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Babis spoke. His voice was shaky at first, but it quickly regained its composure. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, but she was going to ruin everything." His words were chilling. They confirmed what the investigators had suspected all along. This was not a crime of passion. It wasn't a moment of uncontrollable rage. It had been a calculated decision, driven by fear of exposure. Babis' life was crumbling, and Caroline, who had discovered his secrets, had become a threat he could no longer afford to have in his life. The detectives pressed him further. They asked him how he had planned the murder, how he had set the stage to make it look like a robbery. Babis, now with the truth on the table, recounted the details of the crime. He described how he had staged the scene, leaving Caroline's phone behind, making sure her smartwatch would provide false data that would confuse the investigators. He told them how he had stayed calm, controlling the narrative as best he could, even as his world began to unravel. He had never expected that his lies would be exposed by something as simple as a smartwatch, or that the surveillance footage would contradict his every move. The detectives didn't interrupt him. They let him talk, each word confirming their suspicions, each sentence painting a more complete picture of the cold, calculated nature of his crime. As Babis spoke, the detectives carefully examined his body language. They knew this was the moment when a suspect either fully admits their guilt or tries to backtrack. There was no going back for Babis. He had already admitted to staging the robbery, to killing Caroline because she had threatened to expose him. But it was clear now that Babis was also fighting with his own guilt. The confession came with a sense of inevitability, but there was no remorse in his eyes. When Babis finally stopped speaking, the room was still. The truth was laid bare. His motives were clear, and the evidence was irrefutable. Caroline Crouch had been murdered not by random intruders, but by the person who had sworn to protect her, the man who had promised to love her. Babis had murdered Caroline to keep his dark secrets hidden, to preserve a life built on lies. The woman who had loved him, the woman who had trusted him, was dead, and it was his fault. The detectives knew that this was only the beginning. Babis' confession was a crucial step, but the real work was just beginning. They would now move forward with the case, gathering more evidence, preparing for trial, and ensuring that justice was served. The courtroom was filled with tension. The case of Caroline Crouch had captured the attention of the nation, and now it was time for justice. The investigation was over, the evidence was clear, and the only thing left was for the legal system to take its course. Babis Anagnostopoulos had confessed to the murder of his wife, but the question remained, would the court accept his confession and convict him of premeditated murder, or would there be any last-minute twists in the case? Babis sat quietly in the defendant's chair, his face a mask of stone. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a look of resigned inevitability. He had already admitted to killing Caroline, but now he was about to face the consequences of his actions. The trial was his moment of reckoning, and he knew it. His defense team had worked hard to portray him as a man who had acted out of desperation, a man who had been under extreme stress. They argued that Caroline's death had been a moment of rage, that Babis had been overwhelmed by the fear of losing control of his life. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They knew this was a cold-blooded crime, carefully planned and executed by a man who had been hiding his secrets for too long. The prosecution's case was airtight. They presented the evidence methodically, starting with the forensic analysis. The absence of any physical evidence supporting Babis's claims was damning. There were no signs that he had been tied up or restrained, despite his initial testimony. The smartwatch data, which had been so crucial in cracking the case, showed that Caroline had been alive for hours after Babis had claimed she was dead. Then there was the surveillance footage, which completely contradicted his account of the events. Babis had claimed that intruders had fled the scene, but the footage showed him leaving the house alone, hours after the murder. This was no random robbery gone wrong. It was a carefully orchestrated crime. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that made Babis' guilt clear. It was the psychological profile that had emerged. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who was desperate to protect his criminal activities, a man who was willing to kill his wife to keep his secrets hidden. The details of Babis's past were laid bare. His history of manipulation and control, his involvement in criminal activities, and his growing fear that Caroline would expose him for what he truly was. These factors all pointed to a premeditated murder. The detectives had already determined that Caroline's death was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It was a calculated decision, carried out by a man who had planned every step, knowing exactly what he was doing. As the trial progressed, Caroline's family sat quietly in the courtroom, their eyes fixed on the man who had taken their daughter's life. Caroline's parents, in particular, struggled to maintain their composure. They had lost their daughter in the most horrific way, and now they had to watch the man who had killed her try to escape the consequences of his actions. But the evidence was undeniable. The defense had no chance of countering the mountain of proof that had been presented. It wasn't just the forensic data. It was the emotional toll that Caroline's death had taken on her family. Caroline had been a young woman with so much life ahead of her, and now she was gone. The realization that her death had been caused by the very person who was supposed to love her and protect her was too much for her family to bear. Babis sat through the trial with a stoic expression, but inside he was fighting a battle of his own. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in. For weeks he had denied the truth, clinging to his fabricated story about the robbery. But now, as the evidence piled up, he had no choice but to face the fact that his life was over. His lies had caught up with him, and there was no escape. The confession that he had made to the detectives was no longer just a statement. It was now a part of the legal process. He had admitted to killing Caroline, but he would soon face the consequences of his actions. The defense tried to argue that Babis was a man in the throes of a mental breakdown, that his actions had been influenced by extreme stress. They painted him as a man who had snapped, overwhelmed by the weight of his own secrets. But the prosecution countered with a simple truth. Babis had planned the murder. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated act, carried out by a man who had everything to lose. The prosecution's case was clear. Babis had killed Caroline to protect himself, to protect his life of lies and crime. There was no excuse for what he had done. The closing arguments were made, and the jury deliberated. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Babis sat quietly, his hands clasped in front of him, waiting for the verdict. He had confessed to the crime, but now he had to wait for the legal system to decide his fate. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict. Babis Anagnostopoulos was found guilty of premeditated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of emotions. For Caroline's family, there was a sense of justice. Though it would never bring their daughter back, at least Babis would be held accountable for his actions. But for Babis, the reality of his conviction set in. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for the crime he had so callously committed. As the verdict was read, Babis' expression remained unchanged. The cold, calculated man who had killed his wife to protect his secrets was now a convicted murderer, his fate sealed by the very system he had hoped to evade. For Caroline's family, the trial had been a long and painful process, but they had finally seen justice served. It would never bring Caroline back, but at least they could rest knowing that her killer had been held accountable for his actions. The gavel had come down. The conviction was final. Babis Anagnostopoulos was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The courtroom had heard the evidence, the stories, the confession, and the outcome was clear. But for the Crouch family, the verdict did not provide closure. It never could. The loss of their daughter, sister, and mother could not be undone by a judge's ruling, no matter how final. They had lost her forever, and no legal proceeding could ever fill that void. In the days following the trial, Caroline's family was left to grapple with the aftermath. Her parents, particularly her father David, struggled with the weight of what had transpired. David had never imagined that the man his daughter had loved, married, and had a child with would be the one to take her life. He had watched as Babis presented himself as the victim during the investigation, claiming to be helpless, bound, and unaware of the true events unfolding in his own home. But as the evidence had mounted, the truth was undeniable. Babis was not the victim, but the perpetrator. He had killed the woman he was supposed to protect, the mother of his child. That fact sat heavily with Caroline's family. David spoke little after the trial. He was a man who had been robbed of his daughter in the most horrific way possible. His grief was visible to all who knew him, but there was also a deep sense of anger. Anger that Babis had taken Caroline from him, anger that Caroline had been trapped in a relationship with a man capable of such cold, calculated violence. And now David had to raise his granddaughter, Lydia, who would grow up without her mother. Lydia, only a child at the time of the murder, was placed in the care of Caroline's parents. The young girl would have to grow up with the knowledge that her father had murdered her mother. But for now, the Crouch family was focused on giving Lydia a stable environment, away from the chaos and media attention that surrounded the case. They hoped that, in time, Lydia could find healing, even if it would never be the same as having her mother by her side. For Babis, the reality of his actions began to set in. The man who had once been so confident, who had lied and manipulated his way through the investigation, was now facing the consequences of his crime. Behind bars, Babis had little to say. His confession in the interrogation room had been the final act of a man who had been cornered by his own lies, and he showed little remorse for what he had done. In interviews later, prison psychologists noted that Babis was a man who had struggled with deep feelings of control and fear of losing his life of privilege. It was a combination of desperation and arrogance that led him to kill Caroline. He saw her as a threat, someone who could take everything from him, and so he decided to take her life instead. Babis' life in prison would be a stark contrast to the one he had lived before. No longer the successful helicopter pilot, no longer the man with a family, he was now just another inmate in a correctional facility. His days of manipulating others, of controlling the narrative, were over. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, cut off from the world he had known, from the power he had once wielded. The control that had defined his life was now gone, replaced by the cold reality of his crime. As for Caroline's legacy, it was something that could never be forgotten. She was more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother. She had been a young woman with a future ahead of her, a future taken away by a man who could not control his own actions. The Crouch family would carry her memory with them for the rest of their lives. They would remember the good times, the moments of joy, and the love that Caroline had brought into their lives. But they would also carry the weight of her death, a weight that would never fully lift. The case of Caroline Crouch would remain in the public consciousness for years to come. It was a reminder of how a seemingly perfect life could be shattered by the hidden darkness of someone's past. It was a story of manipulation, control, and betrayal. And it was a reminder that the people we trust the most are sometimes the ones who can hurt us the deepest. Babis Anagnostopoulos was sentenced to life in prison, but for Caroline Crouch's family, the legal outcome brought little solace. The loss of their daughter, sister, and mother could not be undone. Caroline's father, David, was left to raise Lydia, his granddaughter now orphaned by the very person who should have protected her. Despite the trauma, David and his wife made sure Lydia was raised in a loving, stable environment, free from the media circus surrounding the case. Babis, now imprisoned, faced the consequences of his actions. The man who had once controlled every aspect of his life was now stripped of everything: his family, his freedom, and his facade. Behind bars, the realization of his crime weighed heavily on him. He had killed the woman he claimed to love, not in a moment of rage, but in cold calculation to protect his secrets. The case left a lasting impact on the public, shining a light on the hidden dangers of domestic violence. Caroline's death was a tragic reminder that even in seemingly perfect relationships, control and manipulation could thrive. Caroline's family, devastated but determined, continued to honor her memory by creating a foundation to raise awareness about domestic abuse and help others escape similar fates. Caroline's legacy would not be defined by how she died, but by the love she gave and the change her death spurred in the world. The fight for justice didn't end with Babis' conviction. It was only the beginning of a broader movement to protect others from the dangers that had claimed her life. As we wrap up this story, it serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of trust and the dangers of control in any relationship. Caroline's story teaches us that no matter how perfect things may seem on the outside, we must always be vigilant about our emotional well-being and safety. If something doesn't feel right, we have the power to change it. I encourage all of us to reflect on the relationships in our lives and ensure that we are living in environments where respect, love, and honesty thrive. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think society is doing enough to raise awareness about domestic violence? Or do you feel more can be done? If you found value in today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel for more true crime stories. Let's continue to share and learn from these powerful stories together. And if you're not a fan of this video, please let me know why. Feedback is always welcome, and it helps me create content you'll enjoy. Thank you for being part of this journey.